Welcome to the University of Northampton Popular Music Podcast. Hi there, my name is Dr. Stace Constantinou. I'm a senior lecturer and the programme leader for popular music at the University of Northampton. So John Sinclair, you're the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Science and Technology.
That's correct. Yes.
And it's lovely to have you on our podcast, so thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Stace. I'm looking forward to it.
It's my pleasure. So, John, tell us a little bit about how you started out in academia.
Okay, so I did my first degree in geography at the University of Aberdeen in the early to mid-1980s. And whilst I was doing that, I was very much focused on physical geography, so the physical environment has always been what's interested me. And in my final year, so Scottish degree, it was a 4-year degree. In my final year, lots of the work that I was doing was seminar-based, so having then given presentations during seminars on 2 or 3 of my modules, one of my lecturers at the time, Dr. Alistair Gemmell, approached me and said, "That was really good. You're good at this. You could maybe consider a career in academia, but you'll need a PhD. So if you want to follow this up, you need to start looking for PhD positions." That sort of sparked interest in me because I didn't know what I wanted to do after university. So I started looking around, and quite late on, whilst I was doing my final exams, there was a PhD place that was advertised at City Poly in London, and the great thing about it was it came with a salary because it was a research assistant job. And the salary looked really good because it was quite similar to the starting salaries that some of my flatmates were getting staying in Aberdeen and going into accountancy. What, of course, I didn't know was how expensive life would be in London, but hey. So I applied for that, I got that, I did 3 years at City Poly, and then as that was coming to an end, I was very, very lucky to get my first lecturing job, which was at St Mary's, now St Mary's University, then St Mary's College in Twickenham. And honestly, Stace, you could not ask for a better apprenticeship in teaching and higher education than St Mary's was able to provide, because it was a teacher training college. Everybody was steeped in pedagogy and the practice of learning, teaching and assessment. And I learned so much in my 4 years there. And I'm very grateful to the colleagues that I worked with there for the support that they gave me, and also some fantastic students whilst I was working there too. Whilst I'd been at City Poly, they ran a master's programme, and I met a guy who was doing the master's who was very, very much a mature student, who was the head of earth science at Nen College in Northampton. And we got to be quite friendly, and we did quite a lot of work on fieldwork together. And he said to me that he was planning to retire in the early 90s. He would let me know when he was going to go, because he felt that if I could get some solid teaching experience under my belt, I'd be a good candidate to replace him. He was as good as his word. So in 1993, he let me know, and I saw the advert. I applied for the job at Nen College and was successful in getting it, and became the subject leader for earth sciences here at Nen College, which became the University of Northampton. So I've now been at the university and its precursor institutions for over 30 years. I worked up to become head of division for environmental sciences in the early 2000s, and then quite quickly after that was associate dean in what was the School of Applied Sciences first of all in 2004, and then became Deputy Dean in the School of Science and Technology, Acting Dean from 2014, and became Dean of the combined Faculty of Arts, Science and Technology in 2016. So this institution has been incredibly good to me over the years. Unbelievably wonderful people that I've worked with over the years, including yourself and the rest of the music team, Stace. And I did just so many wonderful students over the years as well. Obviously, originally in earth sciences and geography, those were the students I knew best. But over time, in my role as dean, I've come to know some students, but lots of students won't know who I am because really they only either encounter me when I'm giving a welcome presentation on an open day, or if they've been very, very bad, they have to come and talk to me, or when I announce their names at graduation. So really, for the majority of students, they don't know who I am, they don't know what I do, but I'm responsible for all of the programmes within FAST, so that's everything from fine art and fashion at one extreme, through journalism, music, acting, environmental sciences, biosciences, and onwards to technical computing, lift engineering and non-destructive testing. So a very, very broad faculty, really interesting faculty with lots of incredibly talented people, some fabulous research, and every year we produce just the most amazingly talented students who go on to do great things.
Thanks so much for that, John. One of the things I liked, I found really good about coming to work here was that I was in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and I'm a musician, very creative person, but I love maths and science as well. So I found that very exciting, that combination, and I still find that exciting. I was talking to a colleague in computer science about Markov chains the other day and how we might combine and do something together. And likewise, so you're from a science background, but you love music.
Yes, I love more than music. I love literature, I love films, I love music. So yeah, I mean, FAST is the ideal environment for me to work in because, yes, I'm a scientist, I'm an environmental scientist, and that it continues to be a lifelong interest. But I have always had that real interest as a consumer of culture, and particularly popular culture. And music and literature are probably the two main ones there. So when I was quite young, my older brother George is nearly 9 years older than me. So he went off to university in 1973. And the first time he came home, he brought with him a Sony mono cassette recorder that he'd bought with his grant money. And he brought 3 or 4 cassettes. He brought a number of cassettes over his first trips back, but the ones I really remember are Led Zeppelin 2, Deep Purple in Rock, and yes, Close to the Edge. Classic 70s rock and prog rock albums. And as a 9-year-old, hearing this stuff for really the first time, because you didn't hear rock on Radio 1, and it really was only Radio 1 in the early 70s. My mum always had the radio on in the kitchen when she was cooking, so I remember sort of the Johnny Walker show she always listened to, and a few of the other DJs in the early 70s, but rock music was not a key part of the Radio 1 output, certainly not that a 8-9-year-old was able to listen to. It might have been on in the evenings. And there was very little on television, although I do remember Bowie appearing as Ziggy Stardust on Top of the Pops, and that generating a reaction at school in terms of what on earth was that? But the music's great. So my brother's taste very heavily influenced my early taste. So as a teenager, was really interested in heavy rock. There was a revival of heavy rock in the late 70s, early 80s, so bands like Iron Maiden, but also spin-off bands from some of the big 70s groups, so Gillan, Whitesnake, Rainbow. Those became sort of the staples of my cassette collection and then ultimately record collection as I got older. Other bands also coming out in the 70s, like Rush, for example, I was very keen on. And when I went to university, there was an Aberdeen-based prog rock band who never really broke through. They supported Marillion a couple of times, and Marillion were fantastic as far as I was concerned. That was perfect timing for me that they came to the forefront in the early 1980s. But the Aberdeen band were called Palace. And they're still going, still performing. They perform at European festivals most years. They're very popular in Poland, but just never quite broke through. Their first main album they recorded with Eddie Offord, who'd been the producer for Yes, and it sounded, from all the press coverage, it sounded like it was a very fractious relationship. And it didn't produce an album that really reflected what they could do, which was a great shame. But that's sort of where my musical taste came from. But it has really evolved over the years. So the other band who have been much more successful, although not as well known in England as they are in Scotland and Europe. The other band that I was very much a fan of whilst I was at university, and particularly once I moved to London, are Runrig. So a band from the Western Isles of Scotland play a really culturally important band because they unashamedly sang in Gaelic, and they popularised the Gaelic language to an audience of Scots and Europeans who probably otherwise wouldn't have heard it. I would never have paid interest in the Gaelic language without Runrig. And when I moved to London in 1986, going to see Runrig in pubs and clubs every time they came to London became a really important connection with home. Because it was always a predominantly Scottish audience, and it just felt like I hadn't entirely left. I know it does these days. It doesn't feel that far from the northeast of Scotland to London. In the mid-80s, it was pretty distant because we didn't have social media. We didn't have other ways of communicating. I had a 15 to 20 minute phone call once a week with my mum and dad, and that was kind of the link to home. So Runrig were really important to me when I moved to England initially. But over the years, my musical taste has broadened. So I listen to quite a lot of indie these days. There are bits of world music, blues, and modern takes on blues, and increasingly recently, sort of alt country and Americana. I'm really, really keen on as well.
So thank you for that, John. And how about live music? Do you ever go to live music gigs?
Oh, yes. Because we've had this conversation before, Stace, and you know very well. I absolutely love live music. I don't entirely know why, but even when I was a teenager and before I had the money and the sort of freedom to travel to gigs, I really loved live albums. So when I was about 13, 14, 15, some of my favourite albums were Whitesnake Live in the Heart of the City. There's a Bob Seger live album that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, which I owned from a fairly early stage that I absolutely adored as well. And Rainbow Live on Stage. The way those albums capture the fan experience, I think, is really well done. The production isn't always that brilliant when you listen back to them now by comparison with modern live albums, but the excitement that they capture, I think, is really, really fabulous. So when I went to university in Aberdeen, I started going to gigs pretty much straight away. I had been to a couple of gigs whilst I was still at school. So the first live band I ever saw, this might make you laugh, was the band called Sky, who were the sort of classical rock crossover. So that tells you where I came from in terms of my taste. And that was a school trip. That was authorised, that we went into Aberdeen to see those. So that was my first ever proper live experience of music. My second live experience of music was Queen at the Highland Showground in 1982. Just before I left home to go to university. And that remains one of my 3 favourite gigs of all time. But even now that I'm a very experienced gig goer, that was still a fantastic experience. So yes, I go to a lot of gigs. So what I often joke is that there isn't a lot of overlap in my musical taste with Linda, my wife's, but we're collecting 70s rock stars before they die at the moment. So over the last few years, we've been to see Fleetwood Mac, who've recently announced they won't tour again. We've been to see the Eagles. Linda took me to see Carole King. I was a bit nonplussed by that and wasn't sure I wanted to. She was great, really good,
brilliant songwriter.
After that, we also saw, because it was one of the British summertime events at Hyde Park. So the support acts that she had that day were Don Henley from the Eagles. He was great. And Michael Kiwanuka. He was absolutely fantastic. And we've seen, a real highlight there was seeing Paul Simon. And this year, been to see Springsteen and the E Street Band. First time was with both times were with friends who'd not seen him before. So we went to Birmingham and we were just sort of in the standard standing area, quite a long way away from the stage. It was a really good show. But my friend Linda, so my wife is Linda, but her best friend is also Linda. Friend Linda got fantastically good tickets for BST in Hyde Park. We were 10 feet from the front of the stage, and Springsteen came right down to the front of the stage to perform several tracks. So I have photograph and video of Springsteen being within touching distance, and I doubt I'll top that as a live music experience anytime soon. So he is also, along with Freddie, those are the two best frontmen performers that I have ever seen. I've seen Bruce Springsteen 7 times now. I only ever saw Queen once. I really like the Stables in Milton Keynes. I think it's a great little venue. I've been to see a guy there called Chris Drever, who you might have heard of, Scottish folk royalty, really, Chris Drever. He's also in the group called the Spell Songs. So he's done quite a lot of work with other Scottish folk artists, such as Julie Fowlis. But he was performing acoustically and solo at the Stables earlier this year. He's also in Lau, the Scottish sort of jazz-influenced folk group as well. He was excellent. I've seen, so wife and I go to see 70s rock stars. With daughter, it's indie or indie-related. So she and I this year have been to see Florence and the Machine. I think that was the 5th time we've seen Florence. That was really good up at Birmingham. We also went to see the Black Keys. Just edged it for me against Springsteen this year in terms of being the best gig I've seen so far. The Black Keys were phenomenal at the O2. We are going in a couple of weeks to London together to see a guy who very few people will have heard of, called Gregory Alan Isakov, who is a South African based in Colorado who does mournful Americana. We saw him supporting the Lumineers, and he was genuinely the best support act I've ever seen. He sort of shuffled to the microphone halfway through his set and said, "We don't have any happy songs, we just have slightly faster sad songs, and that suits me and Vari, my daughter, down to the ground." So we're going to see him again. And the other band I've seen this year who were terrific, although the set list was not the best for me because I don't know their back catalogue that well. I've come to them quite late, and that's the National. But brilliant show, great musicians, really good atmosphere as well, and a very, very diverse crowd. I often look around the audiences when I go to live music and think predominantly white, predominantly middle-aged, predominantly middle class. Sometimes not. I went to see a band called Crangbin last year, and I was by some distance the oldest person in that crowd. But the National audience was genuinely very mixed, very diverse. The sort of 2 girls in front of me were late teenage, and the 2 guys behind me were older than I was. just a real sense of community at that gig, which I think is part of why I love live music, and that's what Springsteen brings. It's almost a religious experience going to a Springsteen gig, because everybody knows the words, everybody sings along, but respectfully, without sort of bellowing in each other's ears, and he just knows how to manipulate an audience to have the best time possible.
So, John, do you use streaming platforms, or do you still buy records and CDs and cassettes? How does this work then for you?
So yeah, routinely I do use streaming, because it's just all the music I could possibly want is instantly at my fingertips, and certainly now that it is routine to be able to connect up in your car, and usually there's enough phone signal to be able to just stream music and control the streaming in your car using Apple CarPlay. That's really transformed my listening experience. But yes, I do still buy music. When I love an album or love an artist, I insist on owning the physical thing, which currently is CDs. So we've got an enormous collection of CDs at home. And one of my retirement projects, because as you know, Stace, I've announced that I'll be leaving the university at the end of this academic year. One of my retirement projects will be to organise those, but also get them out on show. They're all tucked away at the moment, but I want those to be out and accessible and to be being used fairly regularly. But the other thing is, I'm hoping to go back to vinyl. I've got a lot of vinyl. I've probably got best part of 200 albums in the loft at the moment. I don't know what state they're in. They've been up there for over 10 years. So the plan is to get those out before Christmas, check the state of the records, and if they are still in good condition, then I'm aiming to buy a turntable. When I went into my second year at university, because I spent all of my summer holiday earnings on this, was a dual CS505, which hi-fi buffs from the 80s will remember fondly. It was the sort of top-end entry-level turntable, and I had that for many years, and until it simply wasn't functional anymore. So I want to replace that with the nearest equivalent. They're still making those turntables. You can still get them. So the aim is that around about Christmas this year, I'll hopefully have re-established my love of vinyl and get some of those things out that simply aren't available on either on streaming or on CD. There are definitely, I would say, probably 20 to 30 vinyl albums in that collection that I just can't get access to in any other way.
With vinyl, it's also the handling of it.
It is, yeah.
And putting it onto the
it's a
thing
tactile
and
experience.
Cleaning it.
Yeah, all of that, and cursing the pops and the jumps and. But yeah, I will admit that much though I loved the vinyl, and I look forward to going back to it, for things like the opening of "Wish You Were Here." The side one of "Wish You Were Here" by Pink Floyd, having that just fade in from nothing as opposed to crackling and spitting on vinyl is probably how the guys in Pink Floyd intended it to be heard.
So you mentioned retiring, and one of your retirement projects. Would you like to say anything more about that? Yeah,
so my wife retired in February this year, so she's well and truly into the swing of it. I'm looking forward to it. The first thing I need to do is finish the PhD, because whilst I started it in 1986, I never actually finished the thing.
What's your PhD in?
Sorry, the impact of glaciation on sea level change. So what I'm really interested in, Stace, is really long-term climate change. So climate changes over 10,000, 100,000, even million-year timescales. And looking at how the waxing and waning of ice sheets primarily influences sea level, and then how those changes in sea level influence coastline configuration. So I've done quite a lot of work in the past in Suffolk and Norfolk on that, and over the last few years I've been doing some work down in South Devon, and I need to get that South Devon work published. So the plan is that I will submit for a PhD by portfolio of publications. So I probably need another couple of papers, and then should be in a position to submit for the PhD. And I do want to finish that. I know that's a sort of itch that I need to scratch. But the other thing is my wife and I plan to travel. So I'm very fortunate that my brother-in-law and sister-in-law live in the USA. We've done quite a lot of travelling around, certainly the western and central USA with them. So we've done sort of Route 66 to the Grand Canyon.
Was that good?
Oh, it was fantastic. Yeah, we did it in winter, which is a really different experience, passing through snowy desert as opposed to hot desert. It was really interesting. The Grand Canyon is just beautiful in the snow. So we did that quite a number of years ago. We've also done Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks with them. We've done...
It's a massive volcano, isn't it, Yellowstone?
Yeah. We've done New Orleans with them, and we are planning... hopefully to go to Alaska and Western Canada together. And my sister-in-law is an excellent Spanish speaker because her research was in Mexico. She's also an academic and has recently retired from university in Las Cruces in New Mexico. So we're also hopefully going to do some of Latin America, probably the Galapagos and Patagonia. So over the next 2 to 3 years.
Following Darwin's footsteps.
A little bit,
a
little bit.
So am I right in thinking in the last 10,000 years there's been 100-metre sea level rise? Yeah.
So peak of the last glaciation was probably around about 16 to 17,000 years ago. So massive ice sheets over northwest Europe, over northern USA and Canada, and those are made up of water that's been evaporated out of the oceans, so sea level falls. So at the peak, sea level was probably about 120 metres below where it is today. It then increased very, very rapidly. The thing about massive glaciers is they take a long time to grow. They don't take long to collapse. So it can be 20, 30, 40,000 years to achieve maximum glaciation, but they can collapse in 3 to 4,000 years.
Did one potentially cause the Grand Canyon?
No, the Grand Canyon is a result of uplift in that area, so tectonic uplift over a very long period of time. But further north, and actually my wife and I drove through this after we left Yellowstone National Park, is an area called the Channeled Scablands, through northern Idaho and Washington State. And those are the result of a massive, catastrophic flood from glaciation. Yeah.
And apparently the Thames was once linked to the Danube. And you can still see the channel under the sea.
Yes,
so it still is in a way.
Absolutely. And that story is related to the work that I've done in East Anglia. I've looked at the sort of contemporary coastline configuration of the very early route of the Thames. So yes, that's certainly something that I'm very interested in as well. And then,
so I hope you don't mind, but worst case scenario then, ice caps now melt, say. What's the highest? Because we're still in an ice age, aren't we? Technically,
yes.
If there's ice on the caps,
so it's very difficult to be certain. Okay. We know pretty securely that the last interglacial, so the last time it was warm before the last glaciation, which was about 120,000. So we're talking about a time period around 120,000 years ago when it was warm. It's a short-ish warm event, similar to today, because the warm periods in an ice age tend to be shorter than the cold periods. So that episode in Britain is called the Ipswichian, in Europe it's called the Eemian. The sea levels globally then were probably 5 to 7 metres higher than today. There is an earlier interglacial, which is about 400,000 years ago, which in the UK is called the Hoxnean, although there's a little bit of debate around some of the naming here. That does seem to have been quite a long interglacial, and sea levels do seem to have been significantly higher than today, maybe as high as 22 metres above present day levels. So you're talking around 70 feet. That would bring the coastline quite a long way inland. There wouldn't be much of Norfolk left. There wouldn't be much of Cambridgeshire left if that were to happen. The likelihood is that if sea levels were genuinely that high, it's because not only the Greenland ice sheet almost entirely collapsed, but the West Antarctic ice sheet also probably entirely collapsed. And there's been some very recent work that suggests that the West Antarctic ice sheet is increasingly unstable. And even if we put a halt to carbon and methane emissions now, that instability will continue for many decades to come. So there is a real warning from geology as to what could happen in the future. And of course, what we have to bear in mind is that a huge proportion of the global population live within 5 metres of sea level.
And I'm not a geologist, but my understanding is that the natural, let's say humans aren't natural for a second, but the natural warming and glaciation and interglaciation is due potentially to the wobble of the Earth's axis towards and away from the sun. So at the moment, we're moving away from the sun, so we should be getting colder. Is that right?
There are 3 cycles here on different timescales.
Okay.
So one's about 19 to 23,000, one's about 42,000, and one's about 100,000, and they interact with each other. It is probably true to say that without human influence, the Earth would be starting to cool. So there was some really interesting work done about 20 years ago by a guy called Bill Ruderman, an American geoscientist, who identified that early farming started to have an impact on the atmospheric composition and therefore on the greenhouse effect, probably as early as 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. And that's rice cultivation primarily that started to have that impact. And without that, there probably would be areas of reasonably sized glaciation already in northern Canada. But the impact of that, the methane from that rice cultivation has offset the development of glaciers in northern Canada. And obviously since 1750, we've started throwing huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. But yes, broadly, I think you're right. If it wasn't for human influence, we probably would be beginning to cool now, and then that cooling would probably occur in steps over the next 10, 20, 30,000 years. Where we will go because of the impact of human activity on the climate is pretty much anybody's guess, I think.
Exciting challenge, though, if you're being positive about it.
Yes. Yeah.
And we'd have to manage, if we're getting cooler, we'd have to manage that, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I can be a little bit negative, because I do think that probably the lifestyle that I've been used to is not going to be the case for my grandkids. Right. That said, if we do not take action, then things will be significantly worse than they need to be. So we can certainly reduce the impact on future populations by taking action now, and we can all play our part in that. All
right, so if I had to force you to pick 3 songs or pieces of music to recommend that we go and listen to, what would they be? I'm
going to pick 4. So Fans of Radio 6 will know that Radcliffe and Maconie at the weekend weekend breakfast show very often do a thing called First, Last and Everything. So they bring guests in and they talk about sort of the first piece of music that influenced them, what they're listening to now, and what has really stood the test of time with them. So I'm going to take that approach, Stace. So first, it would have to be Led Zeppelin probably, and probably rock and roll. Just excellent track. If you put me in a spot, I would say that my favourite Led Zepp albums are 3 and Physical Graffiti, but the ones my brother had, which influenced my early taste, were 2 and 4. So I'd go with rock and roll. What I've listened to most recently, we're getting towards the end of November, so I'll get the annual feedback from Spotify in terms of what I've been listening to. I'll be amazed if one of my top tracks for this year doesn't turn out to be Eucalyptus by The National, from their album that they released earlier this year. Just a wonderful, heart-rending account of the breakup of a relationship and trying to save the relationship but knowing it won't happen. Great track, absolutely love it, and it's been on repeat in my house. Well, it's been on repeat when I've either had headphones on or I've been in my own office. I did say that my wife and I, there isn't a big overlap in terms of the music that we like. Everything, I'd have to choose a piece of Runrig because they've been so important in my life, and it would be a live piece of Runrig. What I didn't say is I have seen them perform live over 30 times in my lifetime. A lot of that was in small gigs in London between 1986 and 1993, but have been to see them many times. Their live album, which came out in 1989, Once in a Lifetime, was recorded in Inverness. I wasn't in the audience because I was in London at that stage, but the first track on that album, Dance Called America, really captures the excitement of their live performances and the way in which they bring very strong Celtic influences into their music. So I'd recommend that one. And because I said I'm going to choose 4, I couldn't not have a piece of Springsteen, and that would be the live version of Jungle Land from the Live in New York City 2000 album that he brought out after he reunited with E Street Band and before several of the key members of the E Street Band sadly passed on. So it's the joy of a band coming back together who know each other inside out, who trust each other completely, and can take a classic song from an unbeatable album, Born to Run, and make it even better than it was originally.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stace. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. If you found it enjoyable or interesting, please like and subscribe, and even leave a comment down below if you like.